Justice Sarah Chen killed her grass on purpose. As she watched the landscaping crew remove the last patches of perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass, her new neighbor Agnes Peterson nearly dropped her morning coffee. "She's destroying the yard," Agnes whispered into her phone, presumably reporting to the HOA. Sarah smiled, knowing the native plant seeds in her greenhouse were just waiting for their moment. After 15 years of parsing constitutional law on the Supreme Court, she was ready for a different kind of judgment, one that involved butterflies instead of bureaucrats. The decision to move to Oakwood Heights hadn't been an impulsive one. Sarah had spent months researching neighborhoods, looking for the perfect balance of privacy and community. What she hadn't counted on was the militant precision with which the residents maintained their lawns. Every house on Maple Drive boasted the same smooth emerald carpet, cut exactly 2 inches high, a feat that required more chemical intervention than a Hollywood awards show. From her kitchen window, Sarah watched Agnes pace back and forth on her front sidewalk, phone still pressed to her ear. 3 more neighbors had materialized on their porches, drawn by the commotion of the landscaping crew. Mrs. Fitzgerald from number 1539 clutched her pearls as the last roll of sod was unceremoniously tossed into the truck. Mr. Rodriguez, the retired botanist from across the street, was the only one who looked intrigued rather than horrified. "You do realize this is a historic neighborhood." Agnes finally worked up the courage to approach, her designer gardening gloves twisting nervously in her hands. "We've won Best Maintained Community for 7 years running." Sarah wiped the dirt from her hands onto her faded Harvard Law sweatshirt. "Did you know that before this was a neighborhood, it was a meadow?" she asked, pulling out a folder she prepared for exactly this moment. "I have some fascinating historical photographs from 1923. See how the native wildflowers attracted monarch butterflies during their migration. This area was once a crucial part of their flight path." Agnes blinked at the photographs, momentarily forgetting her outrage. "My grandmother used to talk about the butterflies," she admitted. "She said they looked like flying stained glass." "They could again," Sarah said softly, reaching into her greenhouse and pulling out a tray of tiny seedlings. "These are milkweed plants, the only thing monarch caterpillars can eat. I have extra if you'd like to try a small patch in your backyard, where the HOA can't see, of course." Agnes glanced furtively over her shoulder, then leaned in closer to examine the plants. "Howard would have a fit. He measures grass height with a ruler, you know. Last week he fined the Hendersons for having dandelions." Sarah's smile widened. In her years on the bench, she'd learned that the most effective changes often started small, with one person willing to question the status quo. "Well," she said, pressing a small pot into Agnes's reluctant hands, "maybe what Howard doesn't know won't hurt him. Besides, I have a feeling." The orange notice came exactly 73 days after Sarah's meadow bloomed. She counted the days because every morning she'd catch Howard Phillips, the newly elected HOA president, taking photos of her yard from increasingly bizarre angles, sometimes even lying belly down on the sidewalk to capture what he called the invasive menace from ground level. The $500 fine paper trembled in his hands as he taped it to her door, his brand new HOA president badge glinting in the sun. Additional $100 per week for non-compliance, he announced to no one in particular, though Sarah watched the entire performance through her kitchen window while sipping her tea. Howard's crusade against Sarah's garden had begun 3 weeks earlier, when a National Geographic photographer stopped to take pictures of the rare eastern prairie fringed orchid that had somehow found its way into her wildflower mix. The impromptu photo shoot had caused a minor traffic jam on their quiet street, and Howard had emerged from his house clutching his precious HOA rulebook like a shield. Section 7, Paragraph 3, he'd shouted over the clicking of the camera. "All front yard vegetation must be maintained at a height not exceeding 8 inches. His voice had cracked when he noticed the photographer's press badge. This isn't some kind of nature preserve. But it was the butterflies that really set him off. They started appearing in droves, first the monarchs, then the painted ladies, and finally a pair of endangered Mitchell's satyrs that had local lepidopterists camping out on the sidewalk. Howard's morning photography sessions became increasingly frantic, his documentation expanding to include not just Sarah's violations, but also the license plates of visiting scientists and the growing collection of bird feeders appearing in neighboring yards. "He's measuring the height of your black-eyed Susans again," Agnes texted Sarah one morning. In the weeks since Sarah had given her the milkweed seedlings, Agnes had become an enthusiastic convert to the native plant movement, though she still maintained a pristine grass front yard for appearance's sake. Her backyard, however, was becoming a secret butterfly sanctuary. Sarah watched through her window as Howard struggled with his measuring tape in the breeze. He'd started wearing a safari hat and cargo shorts, as if preparing for an expedition into untamed wilderness. The transformation of her yard had affected him deeply. She could see it in the way he obsessively trimmed his own lawn, creating patterns so precise they could probably be seen from space. "This is a clear violation of community standards," Howard had taken to shouting whenever he passed her house. "Property values are at stake." But Sarah noticed he always paused, just for a moment, to watch the butterflies dance through her flowers. The orange violation notice was just the beginning, Sarah knew. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of opponents who thought they had an ironclad case, right before she dismantled their arguments piece by piece in front of the Supreme Court. Howard's handwriting on the notice was shaky but determined, listing infractions like excessive pollinator attraction and unauthorized biodiversity. As she carefully removed the notice from her door, Sarah smiled at the irony. In all his meticulous documentation, Howard had failed to notice the small plaque partially hidden behind her flowering dogwood, the one identifying her as a recipient of the National Wildlife Federation's Certified Wildlife Habitat Award. It was signed by the Secretary of the Interior, who happened to be her former law school roommate. Sarah hadn't won 27 Supreme Court cases by being unprepared. As Howard's fines piled up, she dove into a different kind of legal research, one that made her colleagues back in D.C. raise their eyebrows. "You're reading about dirt?" Justice Roberts texted her. But between Virginia's new Native Plant Protection Act and 3 precedent-setting cases about HOA overreach, Sarah was building something better than a garden. She was cultivating a legal fortress, fertilized by Howard's own bureaucratic zeal. Her dining room table disappeared under stacks of environmental law journals and HOA precedents. The walls became a conspiracy board of string and sticky notes, connecting relevant cases to local ordinances. She'd even ordered the complete minutes of every Oakwood Heights HOA meeting from the past decade. Light reading for her morning coffee. "You know," her law clerk friend James remarked during their weekly video call, "most people just pay the fine." He peered through the screen at her wall of research. "Is that a taxonomic classification of native Virginia plants cross-referenced with endangered species legislation?" Sarah adjusted her reading glasses. Howard cited my butterfly bush as a non-conforming woody shrub, but according to the 1973 Endangered Species Act, combined with the 2023 Pollinator Protection Amendment, it qualifies as protected habitat. She held up a photo of a rare butterfly. This little fellow made sure of that. The deeper she dug, the more ammunition she found. Howard had made a crucial mistake in his zealous documentation. Every photo he took of her yard was time-stamped and GPS tagged, inadvertently creating a detailed record of the local ecosystem's recovery. Sarah had secretly downloaded them all from the HOA's cloud storage. They really should have changed the default password from HOA 1234. "Your Honor," her former Supreme Court colleague Elena texted after receiving Sarah's latest update. "Are you building an environmental law case or planning a revolution?" "Why not both?" Sarah replied, adding another red string to her wall. She discovered that Howard's precious Kentucky bluegrass required 3 times the water allowance permitted under the county's drought restrictions. The HOA had been granted a temporary exemption in 1987, but she'd found no record of renewal. The water bills alone. A notification pinged on her phone. Agnes sending another covert photo of Howard measuring grass length. He'd upgraded to digital calipers and was now wearing a utility belt filled with testing equipment. "He's checking soil fair levels on the Hendersons' lawn," Agnes reported. Mrs. H tried to distract him with lemonade, but he just took a sample for chemical analysis. Sarah smiled, adding the photo to her growing collection. In his obsession with rules and regulations, Howard had overlooked one fundamental truth she'd learned long ago at Harvard Law. The letter of the law was important, but understanding its spirit was crucial. The HOA bylaws, written in 1985, actually included a clause about preserving the natural beauty of the area. She suspected the original authors hadn't meant perfectly manicured grass lawns requiring more chemicals than a meth lab. As she pinned the last string to her research wall, Sarah heard the familiar sound of Howard's measuring tools outside. She glanced at the calendar. The HOA's monthly meeting was in 3 days. Time to prepare her brief. The meeting wasn't going as Howard planned. He'd expected tears, pleading, maybe even immediate compliance. Instead, Sarah Chen, whom he knew only as the garden lady from 1542, had transformed his office into a makeshift courtroom. Her presentation included peer-reviewed studies, property value analyses, and most disturbingly, photographs of his own yard's chemical runoff killing local creek wildlife. "Your lawn care choices have consequences, Mr. Phillips," she said, clicking to the next slide. "Shall we discuss the endangered species implications?" Howard's office, normally his fortress of HOA supremacy, felt suddenly small. The wall behind his desk displayed every best-maintained community award Oakwood Heights had won, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern. His desk held a labeled diagram of approved grass lengths and a color-coded violation tracking system that would have impressed the Pentagon. "Ms. Chen," he began, straightening his 808 president nameplate for the third time in 5 minutes. "While your presentation is certainly thorough, the bylaws clearly state—" "Interesting you should mention the bylaws," Sarah interrupted, pulling out a leather-bound book that made Howard's laminated copy look like a takeout menu. "I took the liberty of having the original 1985 document authenticated by a legal historian. Pay particular attention to Section 1, which emphasizes preservation of the natural environment." Howard's face flushed. He'd never actually read Section 1, having skipped straight to the violations section. "That's clearly not meant to." And here, Sarah continued, clicking to a new slide, "is the water usage data for the past decade. Your Kentucky bluegrass lawn requires 38,000 gallons of extra water annually during a drought. In violation of County Ordinance 47B, she paused, adjusting her reading glasses. "I believe the fine for that is $750 per day, retroactive to the date of violation." Through his office window, Howard could see Agnes Peterson suspiciously examining her own lawn. 3 other neighbors had gathered around her, pointing at their grass with concerned expressions. Someone was holding what looked suspiciously like a native plant catalog. "But the property values," Howard's voice cracked as Sarah pulled out a stack of real estate analyses, "have increased by an average of 23% in neighborhoods with certified wildlife habitats," she finished. "I've taken the liberty of highlighting the relevant studies. The yellow tabs indicate peer-reviewed journals. The blue ones are recent market analyses. The red ones," she smiled, "are your own HOA meeting minutes where you claimed native plants would destroy the neighborhood." Howard slumped in his chair, his safari hat tilted dejectedly. Through the window, he watched a monarch butterfly land on one of Sarah's illegal black-eyed Susans. "The traitor." "I have a proposal," Sarah said, softening her tone. "Instead of fining me, why don't we discuss updating the bylaws to align with current environmental law? I've drafted some suggestions." She pulled out another document, this one bearing the watermark of an environmental law firm. "I think you'll find them quite reasonable, and legally bulletproof." As Howard scanned the document, his face cycling through various shades of panic, a small group of residents gathered outside his window. Agnes had apparently brought refreshments. Someone was taking soil samples. Mrs. Henderson was wearing a Save the Monarchs t-shirt that still had price tags attached. The revolution, it seemed, would be botanized. Howard's emergency HOA meeting backfired spectacularly. He planned to showcase Sarah's yard as a cautionary tale. Instead, Mrs. Rodriguez from number 1546 brought a scrapbook of all the new bird species visiting the neighborhood. The Jenkins twins presented their science fair project about increased butterfly populations. Even Howard's wife asked, rather loudly, why their yard had no birds except those boring brown ones. Sarah sat quietly in the back, her Supreme Court justice robe staying firmly in her car's trunk, while Howard's property values argument withered like his chemically dependent roses. The Oakwood Heights Community Center hadn't seen this much excitement since the great paint color debate of 2022. Every chair was filled, with latecomers standing along the walls. Howard had arranged his presentation materials with military precision: photographs of Sarah's violations, mounted on foam board, charts showing projected property value decline, which he created using clip art and optimistic guessing, and his piece to resistance, a time-lapse video of a dandelion seed floating from Sarah's yard onto HOA-protected territory. As you can see, Howard began, his laser pointer dancing across the screen. This is nothing short of botanical anarchy. He clicked to the next slide, a close-up of a bee visiting Sarah's unlicensed lavender plants. These aggressive pollinators. That's a rare native bee species, interrupted Dr. Martinez, the retired entomologist from Oak Street. She rushed forward, squinting at the photo. Do you have any idea how significant this is? These bees were thought to be locally extinct. The meeting deteriorated from there. Mrs. Henderson, traditionally Howard's strongest ally in law enforcement, had brought soil samples from various yards. Look at the difference, she exclaimed, holding up 2 jars. Sarah's soil is full of beneficial organisms. Ours is, she paused dramatically, basically dead. Agnes Peterson, emboldened by her secret backyard sanctuary's success, stood up clutching a stack of papers. I've been keeping records, she announced. Since Sarah's garden started, neighborhood water usage is down 42%. The Rodriguez family's allergies have improved. And my granddaughter's elementary school is using Sarah's yard for their ecology unit. From the back of the room came the sound of Howard's wife booking a consultation with a native plant landscaper. Howard desperately tried to regain control, but the HOA guidelines clearly state. About those guidelines, interrupted Mr. Jenkins, the neighborhood historian who normally slept through meetings. I've been researching the original Oakwood Heights marketing materials from 1985. Did you know our neighborhood was advertised as a natural sanctuary, with preservation of native species as a key selling point? Sarah watched as Howard's carefully constructed world of regulation crumbled. His laser pointer batteries died mid-gesture. His property value charts kept falling off the wall. A monarch butterfly, perhaps the same one that had haunted his office, drifted past the community center window, drawing all eyes away from his presentation. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. I have something to say, announced Mrs. Phillips, Howard's wife of 30 years. She stood, smoothing her cardigan. I've been taking a master gardener course online. Howard's face went pale. And I think it's time we talked about that chemical shed in our garage. The one with all the warning labels. She turned to Sarah. Could I perhaps get some advice about native shade plants? Our backyard is so empty. As the meeting devolved into an impromptu gardening workshop, with Sarah's neighbors clustering around her sharing photos of their own tentative natural plantings, Howard stood alone by his fallen charts. Through the window, he could see the sun setting over the neighborhood. In Sarah's yard, fireflies were beginning to emerge, the first seen in Oakwood Heights in over a decade. The revolution wouldn't just be botanized. It would be certified, notarized, and backed by surprisingly enthusiastic community support. And furthermore, Howard was shouting, waving a stack of violation notices. If this rebellious resident thinks she can, point of order, Sarah interrupted, standing slowly. The room hushed, not because they knew who she was, but because her voice carried the weight of decades of judicial authority. Before you proceed with legal action, perhaps you'd like to hear my perspective on Virginia Code SS 55.118 Howard's face cycled through every color in his beloved HOA-approved paint swatch collection. Who exactly are you? The silence that followed her answer was broken only by the sound of his gavel falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The emergency meeting had reconvened after a brief recess during which Howard had attempted to salvage his dignity and his documentation from the floor. His safari hat sat askew, and his HOA president badge had been accidentally pinned upside down in his haste to restore order. The community center's ancient AC unit wheezed overhead, struggling against the heat of too many bodies and one man's rapidly evaporating authority. As I was saying, Sarah continued, her tone carrying the same measured patience she used when explaining constitutional law to first-year clerks. The recent amendments to Virginia's property codes specifically protect environmentally beneficial landscaping practices. I should know. I helped write the majority opinion. Agnes Peterson's knitting needles clattered to the floor. Mr. Jenkins, the neighborhood historian, choked on his coffee. Mrs. Rodriguez was already frantically Googling on her phone. "That's impossible," Howard sputtered, clutching his rulebook like a security blanket. "You're just the garden lady, whoa." He stopped mid-sentence as Mrs. Rodriguez thrust her phone toward him, displaying the official Supreme Court website. There was Sarah's official portrait, looking considerably more formal than her current gardening casual attire. "Oh my God," whispered Howard's wife, her eyes wide. "I've been getting gardening advice from a Supreme Court justice." She paused, then added hopefully, "Can I still get those native plant recommendations?" The room erupted in chaos. The Jenkins twins were already updating their science fair presentation to include constitutional law and butterfly conservation. Dr. Martinez, the entomologist, was frantically reviewing her notes about the rare bee species, muttering about potential legal protections. Someone in the back of the room started humming "Hail to the Chief," though that wasn't quite appropriate for a Supreme Court justice. Howard remained frozen, his citation pad dangling limply from one hand. Sarah could almost see the gears turning in his head as he mentally reviewed every interaction they'd had, every pompous citation of HOA bylaws, every threatening letter, every morning spent photographing her violations while lying prone on the sidewalk. "I particularly enjoyed the photo documentation," Sarah added kindly. "Your attention to detail rivals some of the best legal researchers I've worked with. Though next time, I'd recommend a different angle for the butterfly shots. Lying face down on the sidewalk doesn't provide the best perspective." A laugh rippled through the room. Even Howard's wife was hiding a smile behind her hand. But, the property values," Howard managed weakly, clinging to his last line of defense. "Have you considered," Sarah suggested gently, "that a neighborhood certified as an environmental sanctuary, supported by Supreme Court precedent, might actually increase property values? I have some fascinating data from similar communities across the country." As the implications of this sank in, Howard's expression shifted from horror to dawning calculation. Sarah recognized that look. She had seen it on countless faces in her courtroom when seemingly opposed parties discovered unexpected common ground. "I don't suppose," Howard said slowly, his urban planning degree finally asserting itself over his HOA zealotry, "you'd be willing to help draft new environmentally conscious community guidelines, for the sake of property values, of course." Sarah's native plant law and U workshop was supposed to be a one-time event, but when the local news covered Howard Phillips, former HOA president and notorious lawn purist, asking questions about butterfly bush cultivation, it went viral. Environmental lawyers offered free consultations. Landscapers specializing in native plants were booked solid. Sarah found herself unofficially presiding over a different kind of court, one where the Constitution was written in flower petals and sustainably mulched paths. The community center's largest room had been transformed into what Howard, still struggling with the new terminology, called the garden court. His safari hat had been retired in favor of a more dignified gardening visor, though he still occasionally reached for his citation pad out of habit. Today he sat in the front row, digital calipers repurposed for measuring optimal planting depth, taking notes with the same intensity he'd once applied to documenting violations. "As you can see," Sarah explained, indicating a map of the neighborhood's evolving ecosystem, "the butterfly corridor we've established has already attracted 17 species previously unseen in this area." She nodded to Dr. Martinez, who beamed with scientific pride, and thanks to Mr. Phillips' meticulous documentation, Howard sat up straighter at the mention of his name. "We have proof of the positive impact on local wildlife." The transformation of Oakwood Heights had exceeded everyone's expectations. Agnes Peterson's secret backyard sanctuary had expanded into a community seed exchange program. The Jenkins twins had won not only the science fair but a National Environmental Youth Award. Mrs. Rodriguez's birdwatching club had documented 32 new species, though there was still heated debate about whether the alleged flamingo sighting was legitimate or just Mr. Jenkins' lawn ornament playing tricks in the sunset. But what about maintenance standards? Howard couldn't help interjecting, old habits dying hard. We can't just let everything grow wild. He glanced anxiously at his wife, who was already implementing Phase 3 of their backyard restoration project. Excellent point, Sarah acknowledged, clicking to her next slide. Which is why we've developed these guidelines for managed natural landscapes. Notice how we're actually reducing maintenance costs while increasing biodiversity. She paused as Howard furiously took notes. And yes, Mr. Phillips, you can still measure things. Just different things. The workshop had drawn attention far beyond Oakwood Heights. Representatives from neighboring HOAs sat in the back, trying to look casual while frantically scribbling notes. A state senator had requested a consultation about updating Virginia's property codes. The local garden center had created a Supreme Court collection of native plants, but Sarah had to explain several times that she couldn't officially endorse commercial products. And the property values? Howard asked, his last vestige of concern emerging. Sarah smiled, pulling up the real estate statistics. Up 27% since we implemented the new guidelines. Turns out, people will pay a premium to live in a certified wildlife sanctuary with constitutional backing. The meeting concluded with what had become a new tradition, a community walk through the evolving gardens. Howard, now armed with a butterfly identification guide instead of violation notices, led the way. He developed an unexpected expertise in pollinator-friendly plants, though he still insisted on maintaining precise spacing measurements. As they passed Sarah's yard, now a model for sustainable landscaping, Agnes nudged her. Remember when he used to lie on the sidewalk taking violation photos? Sarah watched Howard earnestly explaining the difference between native and invasive species to a group of visiting HOA presidents. Sometimes, she mused, the most effective legal precedents aren't set in courtrooms. A monarch butterfly drifted past, landing briefly on Howard's visor. He remained perfectly still, consulting his guide before whispering reverently, Danas plexibus, right on schedule for the migration pattern. The revolution had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, one flower at a time.